It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the kind where the sun sits low and golden in the sky, casting long shadows across our suburban cul-de-sac. I remember stepping out onto my front porch, half distracted by thoughts of dinner and half expecting the usual stillness of our quiet neighborhood. Instead, I found a scene that jolted me out of my daydreams and ignited the events I'm about to share. Someone had dismantled the ramp leading from my front stoop down to the driveway. The wooden boards, once carefully measured and placed, were pried free, stacked in a disorganized heap near the sidewalk. Several screws and metal brackets lay scattered like abandoned evidence. My heart thudded in my ears. This ramp wasn't decorative. It was a lifeline for my 10-year-old daughter, Lucy, who has type 1 diabetes and uses a wheelchair due to complications from neuropathy. I swallowed hard. Who would do this? We'd only installed the ramp 2 weeks earlier. It had already changed Lucy's daily life, making it easier for her to get in and out of the house for doctor visits, therapy sessions, or just a breath of fresh air in the sunshine. The city had granted full permission after my endless phone calls, ensuring it met every safety standard. We'd even added slip-resistant strips, mindful of the rainy season ahead. I crouched down to pick up a twisted bracket. The sight of those bent screws made my throat tighten with rage and alarm. My mind flashed to the likely culprit, the rigidly tyrannical member of our homeowners association, Margaret Winslow. Though behind her back, half the neighbors quietly called her the HOA Karen. She had railed against our ramp from day one, calling it excessive, unnecessary, and a blemish on the front of our modest ranch-style house. I fought a wave of panic as I stared at the destruction. What if Lucy needed to leave urgently? She'd had 2 hospitalizations in the past year for sudden blood sugar crashes. Without the ramp, it would take precious extra minutes to maneuver her in and out. Why would anyone risk my child's safety for the sake of some misguided sense of aesthetic perfection? A rustle across the street drew my attention. Margaret herself stood near her mailbox, arms folded, lips pursed. She wore her typical immaculate blouse and pressed slacks, her short, frosted hair rigidly styled, as though it too obeyed her commands. Her expression was triumphant, as if daring me to confront her. Before I could even process a response, she turned on her heel and disappeared behind her door. My heart pounded. I wanted to shout, to demand how she could be so heartless. But something in her final, self-satisfied glare told me everything. She believed she was right. And if you want to know just how far she was willing to push this, and how her actions nearly put my child's life at risk, stick around until the end. Because this story only grows more infuriating, more dramatic, and more critical to hear. My name is Madison Clark. I'm 36 years old, an administrative coordinator at the local hospital, and a single mom. Lucy is my entire world. She's bright, creative, and loves painting watercolor sunsets in her spare time. But since her diagnosis of type 1 diabetes at age 7, we've faced countless challenges. Her condition is complicated by a rare form of neuropathy that affects her mobility. She can walk short distances on good days, but mostly relies on a lightweight wheelchair to get around safely. Despite these hurdles, Lucy's spirit remains unbreakable. She rarely complains, even when pricking her finger for the 6th time in a day to check blood sugar or when she's tethered to her insulin pump. But as she's grown, simple tasks, like leaving the house, became increasingly difficult. I'd watch her struggle down the porch steps, wincing if her ankles flared up. So I saved up. I spent months talking to city officials, ensuring any ramp we built would adhere to local codes and not break any HOA guidelines. In writing, the HOA rules allowed necessary medical accommodations, though they had to meet certain aesthetic standards. I believed we did everything by the book, used neutral-toned wood, kept the structure compact, and even lined the edges with tasteful planters so it blended with the neighborhood's tidy vibe. But from the day the first plank was laid, Margaret Winslow made her displeasure known. She fired off complaint letters, claiming the ramp was not a permitted structure and detrimental to curb appeal. I dutifully responded with documents from Lucy's medical team, explaining her condition and the necessity of this ramp. For a while, it seemed like our official paperwork had stalled her crusade. Now, seeing the ramp forcibly removed, a swirl of dread settled in my chest. How could she have the audacity? If the HOA wanted to fight me on a technicality, they could have sued or demanded modifications, but removing it entirely, especially behind my back, was borderline criminal, and it might even be lethal if Lucy had an emergency. I retreated inside, tears pricking my eyes, determined not to let Lucy see my despair. She was in the living room, flipping through a book. She looked up and offered a gentle smile. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" I forced a smile. We have a small issue outside. The ramp, someone took it apart." Her face fell. "But how will I get down?" A flicker of worry crossed her gaze. She never liked the idea of being stuck. I knelt beside her wheelchair, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and reassurance. "We'll rebuild it, Lucy. Don't worry. I'll figure it out." Even as I spoke, my mind spun. Rebuilding would cost money. And if Margaret had the gall to rip it out once, what would stop her from doing it again? A kernel of fear blossomed. What if Lucy had an urgent blood sugar crash or needed immediate transport? Time was critical in emergencies. Without the ramp, we'd have to navigate the steps, which was precarious and slow. I pressed my lips together, a fierce determination taking hold. This is not over. Early the next morning, I found a letter in my mailbox from the HOA, printed on official stationery, with an air of finality that set my nerves on edge. It read, "Dear Ms. Clark, you have been notified repeatedly about the unauthorized structure, wooden ramp, attached to your property's exterior, as it violated the aesthetic standards of our community and was never formally approved. We have removed it in accordance with subsection 8.4 of the covenants. If you wish to install any further modifications, you must follow the standard request procedure. Failure to comply may result in additional penalties. Sincerely, Margaret Winslow, Enforcement Chair, Silver Oaks HOA." I crumpled the letter in my hand, seething. They can't just do that. We had city approval, plus Lucy's medical documentation. This is beyond cruel. Worse, the letter implied it was the entire HOA's decision, though I suspected it was mostly Margaret's personal vendetta. That afternoon, I marched to the HOA's small office near the neighborhood entrance. A young receptionist, eyes wide, informed me that the next board meeting would be on Thursday evening. Residents with complaints were welcome to speak. My frustration simmered. Thursday was 4 days away, but I had no choice. I spent those 4 days trying to keep Lucy's routine normal. I called our city contact, who was outraged at the ramp's removal, but uncertain how to intervene. "This might be a civil matter," she said. "You have the building permits, but if the HOA forcibly removed the structure on what they claim is common property overlap, it could get messy. You may want to consult a lawyer." "A lawyer? Great. As if I have the funds for that." I thought bitterly, rummaging through my purse to find leftover lunch money to pay for Lucy's next copay. The stress weighed on me, nights turning into anxious speculation about how to forcibly keep my child safe if we needed to exit quickly. At last, Thursday arrived. I left Lucy with a trusted neighbor, Mrs. Donovan, who was well-versed in Lucy's medical routine. Then I headed to the HOA meeting, a folder of documents clutched in my sweaty grip. The meeting took place in a bland conference room, a half-dozen chairs arranged in neat rows. The board members sat behind a long table, reminiscent of a courtroom. At the center, presiding with stiff authority, was Margaret Winslow. She wore a pastel blazer, her hair impeccably coiffed. She greeted me with a tight smile, as if we were casual acquaintances rather than adversaries. The meeting droned through mundane topics: landscaping budgets, a new speed limit sign, a proposal for holiday decorations. I tapped my foot, heart pounding with impatience. Then, an agenda item: review of unauthorized ramp removal. Margaret's voice rang out. "We will now discuss the issue regarding Ms. Clark's structure." As I wrote in the official notice, the ramp was installed without the proper design review, so the HOA took corrective action. I shot to my feet before she could spew more half-truths. "That ramp was authorized by the city as a medical accommodation for my disabled child. You can't just tear it down. You're endangering her health." A mild-looking board member, Mr. Collins, adjusted his glasses. "Ms. Clark, we understand your concern, but the HOA has certain guidelines." I held up a sheaf of papers, guidelines that allow for necessary medical structures if they're not an eyesore. This ramp was unobtrusive, painted to match the house, and we had no official rejection from you. My child's safety is on the line." Margaret huffed. "You never submitted the formal application to the design committee. The ramp extended beyond your immediate property line, violating the community walkway space. We had every right to remove it." Her tone was smug, as though reciting lines she'd rehearsed. My stomach churned. I did submit an application. The city approved it. I have the signatures. If you had concerns about the ramp's measurements, you should have approached me, not torn it out behind my back. That's heartless. A murmur spread among the handful of residents watching. One older woman frowned at Margaret, clearly displeased. Another man rubbed his brow in exasperation. Margaret tapped her manicured nails against the table. We must keep consistent standards for everyone. If you needed a ramp, you should have complied with the full process. It's not the HOA's fault you circumvented procedure. I clenched the documents in my hand. I did not circumvent anything. The city's disability compliance officer said it was fine. I wrote a letter to the HOA about the medical necessity weeks ago. Did you even read it? Silence. Then Margaret sniffed. I received many letters. Perhaps yours was incomplete. She turned to the board with a sweet, artificially sympathetic smile. We can offer Ms. Clark an alternative solution, perhaps a smaller ramp behind the house. She can carry her child out the front if needed. That way it doesn't mar the neighborhood curb appeal. My blood boiled. Lucy weighs almost 70 pounds. She's in a wheelchair because she can't walk down steps safely, and you want me to drag her around the house? Are you hearing yourself? The tension in the room thickened. Mr. Collins coughed nervously. Another board member, Ms. Alvarez, spoke up. Margaret, maybe we should reevaluate. A front ramp might be necessary for emergencies. This is a medical issue. Margaret pressed her lips together, ignoring Ms. Alvarez. We'll take your concerns under advisement, Ms. Clark, but for now the ramp is removed. If you wish to reapply properly, we'll review the design in our next monthly meeting. Until then, any attempt to rebuild is considered an additional violation. A wave of helpless rage swept through me. The monthly meeting was almost 4 weeks away. Lucy was vulnerable now. My voice shook. So you're telling me you destroyed our ramp, and I can't reinstall it for a month? My child could have a medical crisis at any time. That delay is dangerous. Margaret blinked, face devoid of compassion. Rules are rules. If your child's condition is that severe, you might consider more appropriate housing. That might be best for everyone. Her statement hung in the air like a slap. Gasps rippled among the audience. My cheeks flamed. How dare she? I stormed out, tears of fury burning in my eyes. The sound of chairs scraping echoed behind me, but I couldn't bear to listen further. My last glimpse was Margaret's smug expression, convinced she'd won. But inside, I vowed, this isn't over. That night, I cried myself to sleep, head swirling with worst-case scenarios. Lucy's next medical emergency, paramedics delayed by the missing ramp. The memory of Margaret's ice-cold dismissal haunted me like a bitter echo. In the morning, Lucy noticed my puffy eyes and tried to comfort me, which only made me feel guiltier. She shouldn't have to worry about her home being accessible or not. That's an adult's job to fix. But hope arrived in an unexpected form. An email from a neighbor, Carolina Alvarez, the same woman on the HOA board who tried to speak up. She wrote, Hi Madison. This is Carolina from the HOA board. I'm so sorry about last night's meeting. I disagree with Margaret's approach. If you're open to it, I'd like to come by and see if we can figure out a solution. The board doesn't stand entirely behind her actions. Carolina. My heart lifted. At least one person on that board has a conscience. I replied immediately, welcoming her to stop by that afternoon. Sure enough, she came around 4 o'clock, a petite woman in her 40s with a kind smile and a huge binder under her arm. Lucy was in the living room reading, so Carolina and I spoke quietly in the kitchen. She explained that while Margaret was the enforcement chair, the rest of the board was often cowed by her domineering personality. She steamrolled many issues, Carolina said, eyes downcast. It's not right. I joined the board hoping to foster community, not this, tyranny. I sighed, pressing a cup of tea into her hands. I appreciate your honesty, but how do we fix it? She claims I have to wait a month to reapply, which is ridiculous. Carolina flipped open her binder, revealing the HOA's dense bylaws. There's a clause about temporary emergency measures. If a homeowner faces a verified medical necessity, the board can allow a provisional structure until the next official review. Margaret is ignoring that clause. She's pretending it doesn't exist. My stomach leaped with hope. Can we invoke it? She pursed her lips. We need at least a majority of the board to sign off. Margaret is trying to keep them in her corner, but if we present the right argument, maybe we can get enough votes. She paused. I can't promise success. She's influential and manipulative, but I want to try. Emotion welled in my chest. Carolina, that means so much. Lucy's next crisis could be tomorrow or next week. Every minute matters. If you can help me keep a safe egress from my house, I'm willing to fight. Carolina gave a determined nod. I'll rally the others. Meanwhile, gather any medical letters, prescriptions, anything proving the urgent nature of Lucy's condition. Let's make it impossible for them to say no. Her words rekindled my fighting spirit. Maybe we had a shot. Even if Margaret was the loudest voice in the room, she wasn't the only one. So that evening, I compiled Lucy's medical history, the city permit, the insulin pump data, and letters from her pediatrician emphasizing mobility challenges. I put them in a neat folder, marking it with bright sticky notes for easy reference. As I worked, Lucy wheeled over, curiosity in her eyes. "Mom, are we gonna get the ramp back?" Her tone was gentle, hopeful. I stroked her hair. "Yes, baby. We're doing everything we can. Some people might try to stop us, but we won't give up, okay?" She smiled, that soft, resilient grin. "Okay." In her eyes, I saw trust, and I vowed not to let her down. The days that followed felt like a seesaw. On one side, Carolina quietly gathered support among the more compassionate board members, like Mr. Collins, who, according to her, felt uneasy about Margaret's decision but needed a push to stand up to her. On the other side, Margaret ramped up her campaign, distributing leaflets claiming that unapproved ramp structures would lower property values and hamper the uniform appearance of our cul-de-sac. She even strolled door to door, a clipboard in hand, urging neighbors to sign a petition against unsightly modifications. A few naive or intimidated residents complied, not fully understanding Lucy's medical situation. Others politely refused. Some told me Margaret's pitch was borderline fearmongering, suggesting that if my ramp was allowed, the neighborhood would devolve into everyone building whatever they want. Ridiculous, but she knew how to stoke anxieties about property values. In the midst of this, Lucy's health remained stable, thank goodness. But every day without that ramp made me anxious. Maneuvering her wheelchair up and down the short flight of steps required me to lift half of its weight, or rely on Lucy's shaky ankles for extra support. One slip, and she could fall, risking a fracture or a dangerous jolt to her insulin pump insertion site. One evening, as I was helping Lucy inside after a checkup, I heard footsteps behind us. I turned to see Margaret, arms folded, staring with cold disapproval. "That wheelchair is smaller than I expected," she remarked, voice laced with condescension. "You really need a ramp for that?" I stiffened, holding Lucy's elbow to keep her balance. "Margaret, this is none of your business. I have official documentation proving we need an accessible entry." She gave a dismissive sniff. "I just think you're making a mountain out of a molehill. If you can manage those steps now, what's the big deal?" My anger flared. Because Lucy's condition fluctuates, and I refuse to wait until an emergency to prove how necessary that ramp is. Margaret rolled her eyes, stepping closer. "Well, the board will decide. But I'll remind you that majority rules. If you can't abide by our guidelines, perhaps a different neighborhood would suit you better." Her words felt like a slap. My voice trembled. "We own this home. Lucy grew up here. We're not leaving just because you want everything to look uniform. She needs safe access, not your callous commentary." She smirked. "We'll see." Then she strolled off, as if we discussed the weather rather than a life and death issue. I ushered Lucy inside, my mind a storm of outrage. If Margaret believed her intimidation tactics would chase us away, she'd severely underestimated a mother's determination. That night, Lucy's blood sugar dipped unexpectedly low around 2 a.m. Her monitor alarm blared, jolting me awake. Bleary-eyed, I rushed to her room. Lucy was shaky, sweat beading on her forehead. I grabbed a glucose tablet, pressing it gently to her lips. She swallowed, lips pale. "Mom," she croaked, her voice trembling. "I feel dizzy." I rubbed her back, heart pounding. "I know, sweetie. This will help. Just keep breathing." Gradually, her sugar level crept back up to a safer range, and she regained enough stability to sip some juice. Thankfully, we avoided an ER visit this time. But as I sat on her bed in the dark, heart still hammering, one thought replayed. If this had been worse, would paramedics have been delayed by the missing ramp? The possibility churned my stomach. Minutes matter in extreme hypoglycemic events. If an ambulance couldn't wheel Lucy out quickly, the consequences could be catastrophic. Even the time it would take them to figure out an alternate path might cost precious seconds. I pressed a kiss to Lucy's forehead, tears pricking my eyes. She was half asleep now, stabilized. My rage toward Margaret burned fiercer than ever. This ramp wasn't a frivolity. It was part of Lucy's safety net. The next morning, I updated Carolina about Lucy's close call. She looked alarmed, promising she'd expedite the emergency measure motion among the board. Meanwhile, Margaret spread rumors that I was trying to manipulate sympathy, telling neighbors I'd invented crisis scenarios to bypass normal channels. Unbelievable, I hissed to Carolina when I heard. She's going to cast doubt on Lucy's medical condition? Carolina frowned. She's desperate to hold on to her power. But keep faith. Most of the board is tired of her extremes. Let me see how many signatures I can gather for an emergency vote. Gratitude and dread mingled in my chest. Let it be enough. True to her word, Carolina worked tirelessly over the following week. She set up a special board meeting with the support of Mr. Collins and 2 other members, aiming to invoke the temporary emergency measure clause. If they voted in favor, I could reinstall the ramp immediately while the formal design approval meandered through red tape. But Margaret wasn't idle. She fought back with every bureaucratic trick in the book, questioning the legitimacy of the meeting, claiming they lacked a quorum, and belittling the necessity of the clause. On the day of the meeting, we convened in the same bland conference room. 5 board members were present, a bare minimum. Carolina introduced the motion. I presented Lucy's medical documents, describing her near 2 a.m. crisis and highlighting the potential for future emergencies. Some members nodded sympathetically. Others avoided eye contact, likely intimidated by Margaret's glare. We took a quick vote. Carolina, yes. Mr. Collins, yes. Ms. Alvarez, yes. Another member named Sharon, no. She seemed firmly in Margaret's camp. Margaret Winslow, no. The tally, 3 in favor, 2 against. We'd won a majority among the 5 present. I exhaled, relief rushing through me. But Margaret smirked. We need a majority of the entire board, which is 7 members, not just the 5 here. Since we only have 5 present, you're short 1 vote. Carolina's brow furrowed. That's not how we usually interpret it. A majority of members in attendance has always been enough to pass measures. Margaret sniffed. For minor decisions, perhaps. But this modifies the community standards, requiring the full board. You'll need 4 out of 7. Right now, 2 members are absent, and you only have 3 votes. Her smile widened. So the measure fails. My chest tightened. This is insane. We have a majority of those attending. The absent members didn't bother to show up. Why does that let you block an emergency measure? She shrugged. Read the fine print, Ms. Clark. We're simply following our bylaws. We can revisit it at the next monthly meeting when all 7 might be present. She arched an eyebrow. Of course, you'll have to rely on those missing members to side with you. But one of them is out on vacation for 3 weeks, so good luck. Fury and despair warred in me. We'd come so close. She's twisting every rule to maintain control. The meeting ended in chaos, Carolina and Ms. Alvarez protesting while Margaret left smugly. I felt physically ill, like we were trapped in a never-ending labyrinth of HOA technicalities. At this point, I realized I needed professional help. The city official I'd initially contacted about the ramp suggested I consult a disability rights attorney. While I worried about legal fees, Lucy's safety came first. I made an appointment with a local lawyer named Tara Dixon, who specialized in ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, compliance, and housing disputes. Tara was a tall woman with a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. I handed over all the documentation: the city permit, Lucy's medical records, the HOA letters, Margaret's removal notice. Tara scanned them, lips pressed thin in disapproval. I see. They physically removed the ramp, even though you had a city permit and medical necessity documentation. I nodded. Yes, they're citing HOA aesthetic guidelines to override that. They keep delaying or invalidating any vote to restore it. Tara tapped her pen on the desk. Under the Fair Housing Act and certain state laws, HOAs can't unreasonably deny accommodations for residents with disabilities. A wheelchair ramp is a prime example of a needed accommodation. The fact they forcibly removed it is extremely questionable. We might have grounds for a lawsuit. My heart pounded. I can't afford a lengthy legal battle. I just want the ramp back. My child's life could depend on it. Tara offered a reassuring smile. I understand. Sometimes the mere threat of legal action is enough to push an HOA to comply. The best approach might be to send a formal demand letter, citing relevant statutes. If they still refuse, we can escalate. Relief flickered. Let's do it. I don't see another way. That evening, after I left Lucy with a babysitter, Tara and I drafted a comprehensive letter. It laid out the medical need, the compliance with city building codes, and the legal obligations under disability rights laws. We demanded immediate reinstatement of the ramp or a guaranteed temporary measure within 7 days, or we would pursue further legal remedies. Sending that letter felt both empowering and frightening. Margaret had proven ruthless, but maybe the specter of a lawsuit would rattle her enough to yield. If Margaret was rattled, she didn't show it outwardly. Instead, 3 days after Tara's letter landed in the HOA's inbox, I woke to a second official notice taped to my front door. Violation of HOA policy. Ms. Clark, your recent actions in threatening legal measures without fully cooperating with standard procedures represent harassment toward the HOA. Any further attempt to circumvent our established bylaws will incur daily fines. Signed, Margaret Winslow. I nearly ripped the paper in half, rage rising. She's calling me harassing? I'm the one whose child's medical needs are being jeopardized. I fired off an email to Tara, who told me not to fret. It's a scare tactic, she wrote back. They have no grounds to fine you for defending your rights. But the tension ramped up. I found notes slipped under my door from neighbors who said Margaret was visiting them, spinning the narrative that my child's ramp was a non-compliant eyesore. One kindly older neighbor, Miss Fremont, confided she felt pressured to sign a petition. She refused, but worried about crossing Margaret. She's known to retaliate, Miss Fremont whispered. One afternoon, as Lucy and I tried to navigate the steps to leave for a doctor's appointment, we spotted Margaret across the street, filming us on her cell phone. Lucy froze, unsettled by the intrusive stare. I glared at Margaret, but she merely smirked, continuing to record as I struggled to help Lucy down. Is she collecting evidence that we can manage without a ramp? The thought made me nauseous. My child is not some spectacle for your phone, lady. That night, I hardly slept. My anger was overshadowed by a creeping fear. Lucy's health was stable for the moment, but if another crisis struck, we were vulnerable. Even so, I tried to remain strong. A date was set for a formal hearing in 2 weeks, sparked by Tara's demand letter. The board, with their full membership, would have to address our ramp. I prayed it wouldn't be too late. Little did I know, events would come to a head before that hearing, in the most terrifying way possible. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Lucy and I had just returned from a quick grocery run. The autumn air felt crisp, and the sky threatened rain. Lucy's blood sugar had dipped mildly earlier, so I gave her a snack to stabilize it. She seemed fine, rolling around the house, chatting about a new online art class she wanted to take. But around 10 p.m., as I was folding laundry, I heard Lucy call out from her bedroom in a shaky voice. "Mom, I don't feel good." I rushed in. She looked pale, clammy. A quick finger prick revealed a plummeting glucose reading, much lower than usual for her nighttime check. My heart lurched. "Hang on," I whispered, dashing to grab her emergency glucose gel. She tried to swallow it, but her eyes fluttered, and she let out a low moan. Adrenaline surged. I recognized the signs of severe hypoglycemia, potentially leading to a diabetic seizure or unconsciousness. "Lucy, stay with me," I pleaded, punching 911 on my phone. The operator calmly assured me paramedics were on the way. My heart hammered, fear clawing at my chest. We'd never had a crash this abrupt at night. Usually, her continuous monitor beeped earlier. Minutes stretched like hours. Lucy's breath was shallow, her cheeks ashen. I forced another bit of glucose gel between her lips, but her swallowing reflex was weakening. "Come on, paramedics. Hurry." Finally, I heard the wail of a siren, bright red lights flashing outside the window. Relief warred with dread. I dashed to the door to meet them, my hands trembling. 2 paramedics jogged up, carrying gear. The lead paramedic, a sturdy woman named Colleen, asked quick questions about Lucy's condition as they hurried inside to assess her. "We need to get her on a stretcher for transport, stat," Colleen said. "Her blood sugar is dangerously low. We'll start in 4 in the ambulance." I nodded frantically, guiding them to Lucy's room. She was semi-conscious, eyes half-lidded. They stabilized her vitals enough to move her. Then came the moment of truth. We needed to wheel her out to the ambulance. Colleen and her partner, Marcus, lifted Lucy onto a stretcher. They maneuvered it toward the front door. only to confront the small flight of porch steps. Without the ramp, the stretcher couldn't roll out normally. They had to angle it, carefully tilting Lucy, slowing them down. "Watch that side," Marcus muttered, wincing as one end of the stretcher bumped the doorframe. I hovered anxiously, hands pressed to my mouth. Lucy let out a weak moan. Every second felt like a countdown. Colleen cursed under her breath, sweat beading on her brow. "This is ridiculous. We can't exit quickly. Where's your ramp?" My heart clenched. The HOA forcibly removed it. Her eyes flashed with disbelief. "You have a child who needs a wheelchair, and they took away the ramp?" I nodded, tears gathering. The paramedics spent precious moments maneuvering Lucy down each step, nearly losing balance once. My stomach twisted in terror. If they dropped her or jostled her foreline, it could be catastrophic. Finally, they managed to get the stretcher onto the driveway and into the waiting ambulance. Colleen slammed the doors, turning to me. "Meet us at the hospital. We'll do everything we can." I dashed to my car, my entire body shaking. Lucy's life was in their hands, and we'd already lost crucial minutes thanks to an absent ramp. "Please let her be okay. Please." The next few hours at the hospital were a blur of waiting and praying. Lucy was whisked into the ER. Nurses started her on 4 dextrose to stabilize her blood sugar. I hovered by her bedside, stroking her hand, heart pounding as her vitals inched upward. Over and over, the image of the paramedics struggling with the stretcher replayed in my mind. The knowledge that each second counted in a hypoglycemic crisis turned my frustration into fury. Eventually, Lucy's color returned, and she drifted into a shallow sleep, monitors beeping softly. A doctor approached, explaining that we caught the episode in time, but she'd remain under observation for the night. Relief washed through me. I blinked back tears, murmuring thanks. Around midnight, the paramedic Colleen reappeared at Lucy's door, stepping in quietly. She gave a small smile. "How's she doing? She's stable now. Thank you for saving her." My voice wavered with gratitude. Colleen nodded. "I'm glad we could help. But can I ask, what on earth happened with that ramp? You said it was removed?" I took a shaky breath and poured out the story. The wheelchair ramp, the HOA's refusal, Margaret's vendetta. Colleen's jaw tightened. "That's unbelievably irresponsible. Delaying emergency egress is dangerous, especially for a child with a chronic condition." She glanced at Lucy's sleeping form, a hint of anger in her eyes. "We lost valuable time tonight wrestling with those steps. That could have been the difference between life and, well, I don't need to spell it out. If you're open to it, I'd like to file an official report about hazardous conditions." My heart lifted. "A report? Against the HOA?" She nodded, jaw set. "Yes. We paramedics rarely get involved in neighborhood disputes, but this crosses a line. The local fire marshal or city code enforcement might take it seriously if they see an official complaint from EMS about a missing medical ramp that hindered care. It's borderline negligence or endangerment." Tears of relief stung my eyes. "Yes, please. Anything that helps highlight this danger." Colleen handed me a card. "I'll submit the paperwork first thing tomorrow. You keep advocating for your daughter. Sometimes an official statement from emergency services can tip the scales." I thanked her profusely. As she left, a wave of hope mingled with exhaustion. Maybe Margaret's cruelty will finally be exposed. Lucy was discharged the next afternoon with stable glucose levels, though the doctor insisted on close monitoring. We returned home, both of us drained yet grateful. The first thing I did was arrange for a temporary set of portable aluminum ramps from a medical supply company, just to have some solution in place. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it allowed the paramedics an easier path if they had to return. Then, the bomb dropped, Colleen's official EMS report. She emailed me a copy, which stated in blunt terms, "Incident report. On date, EMS responded to a pediatric diabetic emergency at address. Patient was stabilized for transport, but egress was severely delayed due to the absence of a necessary wheelchair ramp. We discovered that the ramp had been removed by the local HOA despite the patient's medical condition. This delay posed a significant risk to the patient's health. We recommend immediate reinstatement of the accessibility feature to ensure timely emergency response in the future." She also CC'd the local fire marshal's office, city code enforcement, and even the building authority. Yes, I thought. Now maybe the city will step in. The next day, word spread quickly. By evening, Neighbors were buzzing about an EMS report condemning the HOA. The rumor was that Margaret was livid, blindsided by the negative attention. A few neighbors texted me that she'd been seen pacing her driveway, phone glued to her ear. Sure enough, I soon received a furious email from Margaret. Ms. Clark, I am appalled by your attempt to drag our HOA's name through the mud by involving paramedics and city officials. We never intended to compromise your daughter's well-being. If there was an emergency, we assumed you would have made other arrangements. This is a gross overreaction. Margaret Winslow. I couldn't believe the gall. She was the one who compromised Lucy's safety, yet she labeled my reaction gross and insinuated I should have other arrangements. Like what? A private elevator? Teleportation? Tara, my lawyer, told me to keep all such communications as evidence. Meanwhile, City Code Enforcement contacted me to schedule an inspection, given the paramedics' report. I prayed this might finally corner Margaret into compliance. Within days, the city inspector and a representative from the fire marshal's office paid our street a visit. Carolina quietly tipped me off that the HOA board was in a panic, with half of them blaming Margaret for her heavy-handed removal. Allegedly, they never expected paramedics to weigh in so forcefully. The officials arrived one sunny afternoon. Lucy was at a friend's house, resting. I greeted them on my porch, showing the steps where the ramp once stood. I explained how we had city permits and medical necessity documents. They nodded, taking notes, occasionally exchanging pointed glances. One official, Ms. Coleman from Code Enforcement, frowned at the missing structure. This is consistent with a scenario where a resident needed disability access. If the HOA forcibly removed it, that's borderline illegal. We typically see the opposite problem. HOAs refusing to let people do anything until they get approvals, but physically removing a medically required ramp is extreme. The fire marshal representative, a tall man named Hicks, chimed in. In an emergency, every second counts. This is a legitimate hazard. The paramedics' report clearly states their delay. If the child's condition had been more dire, the outcome could have been tragic. They wrapped up their inspection, taking photos. Ms. Coleman promised a formal follow-up, but it was clear from her expression that the HOA had stepped out of bounds. My heart soared. Finally, an authoritative voice seized the insanity. Later that week, Ms. Coleman emailed me a brief update. The city was issuing a citation to the HOA for violating disability accommodation guidelines. If they didn't restore a safe ramp or otherwise rectify the hazard, they could face daily fines. I read the email 3 times, my hands shaking with relief. They can't ignore this now. Carolina told me the HOA board scheduled another emergency meeting in light of the citation. I braced myself for more drama, but felt confident we had the upper hand. The next emergency HOA meeting was packed. Neighbors, city reps, even a local journalist curious about the paramedics' condemnation. Tension crackled in the air. Margaret sat at the center of the board table, face pinched, flanked by the other members. I noticed Ms. Alvarez and Mr. Collins avoiding eye contact with her. Harold, the HOA president, cleared his throat. We're here to address the city's citation regarding Ms. Clark's missing ramp. We have been informed that continuing to block its installation violates multiple codes and could result in fines to the association. Margaret forced a stiff smile. Yes, we're aware. However, I maintain that Ms. Clark never completed the correct design review, and the structure was an eyesore. Ms. Coleman from Code Enforcement, who was attending as an observer, spoke up. Ms. Winslow, the city has records of Ms. Clark's permit. Also, under disability accommodation laws, design review cannot unreasonably impede a medically necessary feature. Removing it was not only ill-advised, it was in direct conflict with regulations. The city expects compliance, immediately. Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. But the ramp extended beyond her property line, onto common HOA land. That's a separate matter. Ms. Coleman shook her head. We reviewed the measurements. The original ramp was well within Ms. Clark's boundary. Even if a small corner overlapped onto an easement, the city's disability statutes override minor boundary disputes. Furthermore, the ramp was placed for medical necessity. This is not optional, Ms. Winslow. The hush in the room was palpable. Margaret's bravado faltered. She aimed a desperate look at the other board members, who stared at the table, unwilling to bail her out. At that point, I stood, voice trembling. You nearly cost my child her life. The paramedics lost critical time because there was no ramp. My daughter's condition is real, and she's at risk. I won't stand by while you endanger her again. A ripple of support spread among the onlookers. Neighbors who had once been wary now nodded, outraged at Margaret's callousness. Ms. Alvarez finally found her voice. I propose we immediately approve Ms. Clark's ramp reconstruction. Vote to override any prior enforcement actions. Harold looked exhausted. Yes, let's put it to a vote right now. The board members raised their hands, one by one. Margaret glared, but was outnumbered. 6 in favor, with only Margaret obstinately voting no. Harold banged his gavel. Motion passed. Ms. Clark is granted immediate permission to reinstall her ramp. The HOA will not impose further delays. Additionally, we'll cover any fines or fees due to the city's citation. Meeting adjourned. I released a shaky exhale. We did it. Margaret sat rigid, lips pressed tight, looking like she'd swallowed something sour. She stormed out as soon as the meeting ended, ignoring the crowd's murmurs. Within days, I arranged for a contractor to reinstall the exact same ramp design, but with a few improvements recommended by the paramedics for easier stretcher access. The city's code enforcement office oversaw the process, ensuring everything was safe and up to standard. The contractor was kind and worked swiftly, understanding Lucy's urgency. By the following weekend, the ramp was back, sturdy, sleek, complete with anti-slip treads. When Lucy first rolled down it under her own power, a huge grin lit her face. "It's just like before," she said, pressing her palms on the smooth wooden rail. "Better, even." A wave of relief and pride washed over me. No one's tearing this down again. A few neighbors came by to congratulate us or apologize for not speaking up sooner. I sensed a shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. People were wary of Margaret's overreach, and seeing the paramedics condemn her had opened their eyes to the real risk her meddling posed. Meanwhile, the HOA was forced to pay the city's fine for noncompliance. The total wasn't astronomical, but it was a public mark of wrongdoing. Carolina told me she and others were pushing for Margaret to step down from the enforcement chair. Whether that would happen remained to be seen, but at least she'd lost her stranglehold on the narrative. In the days that followed, Lucy's health stabilized. She still had ups and downs, but the knowledge that an ambulance could reach her quickly, or that she could wheel herself out in an emergency, eased my anxiety. I found myself sleeping better at night, no longer haunted by the image of paramedics struggling with steps. Yet a part of me suspected Margaret might not let this go quietly. She'd tasted defeat, but her pride was formidable. Would she retaliate somehow? Sure enough, about a week after the ramp's successful reinstallation, I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single typed page. "Miss Clark, you may have won the latest round, but rest assured, I will continue to monitor any further violations. Don't assume this ramp is permanent if it deviates from any of our strict guidelines. The association has rights, and you are not exempt simply because of personal circumstances. M.W." My stomach twisted. The letter was unsigned except for initials, but the tone was unmistakably Margaret's. This was intimidation, pure and simple. She's basically threatening me. I showed it to Tara, my lawyer, who said we could file a harassment complaint if necessary. She advised I keep the letter on record, but try not to engage. I tried to swallow my anger, focusing on Lucy's daily life. We had what we needed: a safe ramp, city support, and moral backing from paramedics. If Margaret wanted to posture, let her. But a quiet worry lingered. Is she bold enough to sabotage the ramp again? To protect ourselves, I installed a small security camera by the front door. At least we'd have footage if someone tried to tamper with the ramp. I also let Lucy know that if she ever saw Ms. Winslow near our porch, she should call me immediately. Lucy nodded, looking uneasy. "I just don't get why she hates us so much," she said softly. "I never did anything to her." I hugged her. People like Margaret see the world in terms of rules and appearances. Empathy doesn't factor in. Lucy sighed, her eyes reflecting a sadness no child should bear. "It's not fair, but maybe she'll leave us alone now." I hoped so, for Lucy's sake. Meanwhile, the paramedics' official condemnation still resonated through the neighborhood. Some folks whispered about removing Margaret from the board altogether. She'd tarnished the HOA's reputation, caused near tragedy, and forced them to pay a citation. The backlash was growing. One chilly Saturday, the doorbell rang mid-morning. I opened it to find Carolina and Ms. Alvarez standing on my porch, accompanied by about a dozen neighbors. Some I recognized, others were new faces. They smiled warmly, holding boxes of pastries and coffee cups. Carolina spoke first, her voice bright. "Madison, we wanted to come together to celebrate Lucy's ramp reinstatement. And to say we're sorry this ordeal went so far. We should have stood up sooner." Another neighbor, an older man named Mr. Shanahan, stepped forward. "We read about the paramedics' report, and we realized how serious the situation was. We never meant for you to feel unwelcome or unsafe. So we thought we'd do a little ramp warming, like a housewarming, but for the ramp." He chuckled sheepishly. Emotions swelled in my chest. "That's unbelievably kind. Thank you." Ms. Alvarez nodded. "We also started a petition to remove Margaret from the enforcement chair position. We have enough signatures for an internal board vote. I hope you'll support us in that." Tears pricked my eyes. "I will. Absolutely." Lucy, hearing the voices, wheeled into the foyer. She spotted the group with pastries and balloons, eyes widening. "Hi," she said shyly. Carolina grinned. "Hi, Lucy. We're your neighbors, and we're so happy you have your ramp back." She offered Lucy a chocolate donut, and Lucy's face lit up. I made a mental note to check her blood sugar after, but I couldn't deny her the small treat. The group spent the next hour outside, sipping coffee, chatting about everyday life. A few kids joined Lucy, admiring the ramp. They talked about painting a small decorative panel on the side, with the HOA's permission, ironically enough. The atmosphere felt warm and neighborly, in stark contrast to the tension wrought by Margaret's hostility. I learned that many folks had been quietly uncomfortable with her tactics for years, but hadn't wanted to rock the boat. My situation served as a wake-up call. They realized that turning a blind eye to her behavior could have dire consequences. By the time they left, I felt lighter, as though the pall of Margaret's intimidation had lifted. Lucy seemed thrilled, chatting about new friends. Maybe we'd found a silver lining in this mess, a sense of true community, bound by empathy rather than fear. 2 weeks later, the HOA board convened to address internal matters, including a motion to remove Margaret from her enforcement chair role. The fiasco with Lucy's ramp and the city citation fueled the push. I wasn't required to attend, but Carolina invited me, so I went, partly for closure, partly to see justice done. The room was packed again, neighbors lining the walls. Margaret sat stiffly at the board table, eyes darting with suspicion. Harold, the president, opened the meeting. "We have a motion on the floor to relieve Ms. Winslow of her enforcement position due to misconduct and endangerment of a resident. We'll allow short statements, then vote." Margaret leaped to her feet. "Misconduct?" I followed the bylaws to the letter. Ms. Clark's ramp was never properly. Mr. Collins cut in, surprising me with his firmness. "Margaret, you forcibly removed a critical access ramp, ignoring city permits and a child's medical condition. The paramedics condemned it as dangerous. We all saw the official citation from the city. That's beyond bylaws." A few audience members murmured agreement. Another board member read from the paramedics' report, citing the delayed ambulance exit. The tension built as Margaret tried to spin it. I only did what I thought was best for property values. If anything, Ms. Clark exploited the situation too. "Enough," Harold said, voice taut. "This is about accountability, Ms. Winslow, not your personal vendetta." He called for a vote. One by one, the board members raised their hands, in favor of removing Margaret. She looked increasingly pale, except Ms. Sharon, who'd always backed her, hesitated but eventually voted in line with the majority. Margaret was alone, outvoted. Harold rapped his gavel. "Motion passes. Effective immediately, Ms. Winslow is removed from the enforcement committee. Another member will fill that seat." Meeting adjourned. Margaret's face contorted with a mix of rage and disbelief. She stormed away, ignoring the calls of "Margaret, wait." A hush fell, then scattered applause broke out. I stood in the back, heart pounding, relieved. Lucy's ramp was safe, our right to remain here unchallenged. Carolina found me afterward, hugging me briefly. "Finally, the board can move forward without fear. We owe you and Lucy an apology that it took a crisis to see how far she'd gone." I blinked away tears. "Thank you. Just promise to keep the community caring and inclusive." She smiled, nodding. "That's the goal." With Margaret stripped of her enforcement power, the atmosphere in our neighborhood improved dramatically. People no longer jumped at every passing mention of HOA violation. The new enforcement chair was Ms. Alvarez, who championed a compassionate approach to guidelines, especially for medical accommodations. Margaret, meanwhile, retreated into sullen isolation. Rumors swirled she was considering moving out to avoid the embarrassment. I occasionally spotted her scowling from behind her curtains, but she didn't dare approach our property again. The security camera outside remained as a silent witness that we wouldn't tolerate sabotage. Lucy's ramp remained sturdy, a daily symbol of resilience. The paramedics who'd helped her that fateful night popped in once, checking on her well-being. Colleen gave Lucy a small stuffed ambulance as a playful reminder that they were always ready if she needed them. Lucy beamed, hugging it close. I resumed a semblance of normal life, no longer consumed by legal battles or fear of sabotage. Lucy blossomed with the freedom to come and go independently. She even helped me carry groceries by balancing small bags on her lap. Our next doctor appointment showed good management of her diabetes, her chart reflecting improved mental health as well. Less stress at home, I told the pediatrician Riley. It helps. Occasionally, I'd recall the horrifying moments of Lucy's emergency, the anxiety of the paramedics wrestling with the steps. Each time, gratitude flooded me that we overcame it. The city, the paramedics, Carolina, so many people stepped up when it mattered most. And perhaps ironically, Margaret's cruelty spurred the neighborhood to unify in a way I'd never seen before. Months later, the memory of Margaret's ramp removal still lingered, but the raw sting faded. We forged ahead with a renewed sense of belonging. Lucy joined an online art club, brightening our fridge with her watercolors. On weekends, she'd sometimes roll onto the porch, painting the local scenery from the vantage of her brand-new ramp. One crisp morning, she called me outside. "Mom, look," she said, pointing to a gentle sunrise unfolding across the rooftops. Shades of peach and gold blended in the sky. Lucy had her art kit perched on her wheelchair. I smiled, stepping onto the ramp, the boards steady beneath my feet. "It's beautiful," I murmured. She nodded, eyes shining. "Things got scary for a while, but we made it, didn't we?" My throat tightened with emotion. "Yes, we did. And now we can enjoy mornings like this in peace." She leaned forward, carefully applying brush strokes to capture the dawn's colors. And I stood behind her, arms folded, reflecting on the journey that had led us here. The sabotage, the fear, the emergency, the paramedics' condemnation, and finally the triumph of understanding over ignorance. In that moment, I felt the weight of hard-won victory. The ramp, a simple structure, represented so much more than just wood and screws. It stood for Lucy's safety, for dignity, and for the power of a community that refused to let cruelty rule. As Lucy's brush danced across the paper, I knew that we'd found not only justice, but also a deeper unity in our neighborhood. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying end to Margaret's tyranny we could have hoped for. So if you've been listening, remember this. No matter how imposing a Karen might be, when good people come together, neighbors, city officials, emergency workers, a single ramp can become a powerful symbol of compassion's triumph over arrogance.